David D. Long Jr., United States Navy Reserve retired. Dan, why don't you give us a little of your background on Atlanta, Boys High?
Well, I'd be glad to. You'll notice I was born in York, Pennsylvania as a convenience to my mother. That's where she was from. But I came to Georgia when I was 3 weeks old, and I liked it, so I stayed from then on. So I consider myself a native of Atlanta. I went to 10th Street School. We lived in Ansley Park, and I went to 10th Street School and to Boys High School, to O'Keefe Junior High, to Boys High School, and then to Georgia Tech, and ended up with a degree in general science. After that, I went to work with the Atlantic Steel Company, but I was also a member of the Naval Reserve and was called to active duty in 1940. And I served a year on an ammunition ship during what was known as the Neutrality Patrol. It was before we got into the service. And when the war started in 41, I went to mine warfare school, and when I came out, I was put in command of a succession of minesweepers, starting off with an AMC, the U.S. Governor, AMC 82, and after about 9 months on that, I went to a AM 91, the USS Dynamic, and then to the AM 316, the USS Competent, and then the USS Pochard, AM 375, which was built in Savannah, Georgia. The first one, they served out of Key West, operated there and swept around the minefield that they planted in the Northwest Passage. The Dynamic was sent to Bermuda and became part of the domestic of the Bermuda Defense Force. And while there, I became involved in a rescue effort of some prominent Bermudians who were washed out to sea in a hurricane, and brought them back in and surprisingly received headlines in the newspaper for bringing them back, and also their little ship that they were fishing in when they were washed out. The USS Competent was a minesweeper, served in the Pacific, mostly at the time of the Gilbert Marshall Islands, and they had a distinction on that Admiral Spruance, who was the head of the head of the Fifth Fleet, wanted to go in the Majuro Lagoon and go to visit the native chief there, and none of the big ships could go down into the lagoon, so he called on my ship to come and pick him up, which we did, and we went down through the field of coral heads and all that were such a detriment to everything else, and got him to the end of the island, and they had barbecue with the chief, and then came back. Then the other thing on the Pochard, the important thing about that was that we were operating out of the Sea of Japan during minesweeping operations at the time of the surrender, and I was detached from duty there as commander of Mine Division 23, and my ship joined up with Mine Division 13, which was Leland Jackson from Atlanta. He was in command of that, and we were assigned the job of sweeping into Tokyo Bay ahead of the surrender fleet and get all the mines cleaned up in there in the entrance so that they could get in safely. So that's my claim to fame in the Navy. And after that, came back and I stayed in the active reserve and was executive officer to Captain George Griffin, who I'm sure you are familiar with the Atlanta Battalion of the Naval Reserve, until I retired in 1960.
You know, sweeping mines has always intrigued me as one assignment I wouldn't care to have, but it seems to me that mine technology during World War II progressed rapidly, and it was a constant battle between the technology and counter technology on our part. You care to comment on that?
Well, that is true, but mostly in the European waters where the German mines were, because up until the start of the war, the only thing they had were the so-called contact mines, where you had to actually bump into them to detonate them.
And they exploded on the surface, didn't they not?
Well, they were anchored just below the surface, maybe 5 or 6 feet, so you couldn't see them. But then they developed the so-called magnetic mines, which the signature of the ship passing over would cause it to explode. And then the acoustical mine, where the sound of the propeller of the ship would cause it to explode. And later on during the war, the pressure mine, where the pressure of the hull going over it would detonate it. So as you say, they had a lot of changes in that, but fortunately for me, the Japanese didn't inherit any of the technology that was needed to do that from the Germans. And the only trouble that we had with any of those new type mines were our own mines, the U.S. mines that were flown in and dropped by naval airplane, and sometimes they were 8 or 10 miles away from where they thought they dropped them. Then we had to go find them and bring them back.
What type of detection equipment did you have? Was it sonar or magnetic? Or?
No, that had not been developed. They use that now. We had sonar, and but you couldn't pick up a mine with sonar in those days. It wasn't enough to do it. And we had radar also, but that was used only for surface ships and not underwater.
When you detected a mine, what was the technique you used to, what's the proper word, defuse them, I suppose?
Well, we didn't do it in those days. They only, during the war, if you detected a mine, it was exploded. That's how you detected it. The object was to explode them, and that way render them harmless. It wasn't until after the war that they developed techniques to locate and identify and then destroy them.
But you would use deck guns or some type of...
If they came to the surface, we'd use deck guns to shoot them and sink them. Or usually you'd have a small gunship following you around, and any of them that came to the surface would be detected and sunk or detonated.
Well, you must have had some very interesting experiences, having started so soon in Key West and then Bermuda, and finally out in the Pacific.
Well, we had some very pleasant experiences, had some scary ones, and but all in all, it was a very pleasant duty. And I didn't know any better in those days.
Yeah, we were all young and ready to go, weren't we?
Right.
You mentioned the two individuals you saved. I see that you have a newspaper account from the Bermuda newspaper. Would you care to tell us about that?
Well, I have that little write-up of it there that I'll give to you, and you can make copies of it. I'd like it returned to me. But what happened is there was a storm out in Bermuda, and these two prominent Bermudians were out in a fishing boat, and when the storm came up, they tried to get back in, the engine wouldn't start, and so they drifted out at sea for about 10 days. And the head of the Bermuda asked Admiral the Navy Fleet, Jules James, to send some ships out, see if we could locate them, the planes, and find them. But the weather was too rough for the planes to operate for several days, and then when they finally could, they did locate them, and my ship was on the harbor defense at that time, and we were sent into that area and do search battles, and the planes showed us where they were, and so we went and picked them up, and the boat was pretty badly damaged, but I decided to try to salvage it and bring it back in, which we did. And we called them at St. George's and told them we were coming in the next morning. And I thought I'd sneak in quietly and turn them loose. Surprisingly, there were hundreds of people down on the dock there to greet the two Bermudians and to see the ship that had rescued them. So that was...
You became a local hero.
That was what was written up in the paper, which is the Gazette and Colonist Daily, which is the newspaper in Bermuda. But in those days, Bermuda did not have any motorized vehicles. Everything was horse-drawn, except the railroad that ran between Hamilton and St. George. So it was a very quiet and pleasant place to live. But when I went back there several years ago, they had mopeds and automobiles and all around, and it was really too noisy and bustly to be as enjoyable as it was in the olden days.
Well, that's happened in so many places. I remember Florida in World War II. Now it's wall-to-wall condominiums on the East Coast.
Yeah.
I've always been an admirer of Admiral Spruance. He was a commander at Midway, which some people say was a turning point of the Pacific War. Did you have an opportunity to get to know him at all when you delivered him on?
No, I said hello, saluted him, and welcome aboard, sir, and then I set him up in the wardroom with his staff, and so I was up on deck helping navigate through the tangle of coral heads that were there to get him down to the south end of the island, which was about 15 to 20 miles, to where he could go ashore and visit with the chief.
He was on a diplomatic mission, really, wasn't he?
That's what it was, yeah. But the northern part of the, well, I guess it was the northeastern part of the island was fairly clear and was used as an anchorage for all the Fifth Fleet, because there were no coral heads in that part of it. It was just in the other end of it that was infected with them.
You were in Florida and Bermuda early on, and I recall that early in World War II, the German submarines were very active along our east coast. As a matter of fact, I was stationed in Florida in 1943, and the beaches, most of the beaches on the east coast had just become covered with oil. They were sinking in tankers. Did you get involved in that at all?
No, I didn't. I was fortunate we didn't run into any submarines at all. And it was before the invasion of North Africa, because they were building up Bermuda and building an airfield there to use it as covering for the convoys that were going to go to North Africa. But I got detached from there before they actually started, so I didn't get involved in any of that.
And when were you reassigned to Pacific?
I think that was about 1944. See, 42 was the governor, 43 was the dynamic, and 44 was the competent, and 45 was the pochard. So those were the 4 years that I spent on different ships.
You had 4 commands in this.
4 commands, yes.
Would you compare the Pacific War with your experiences in the Atlantic?
Compare the what?
What were the differences between what you found in the Pacific and what you found?
Oh, the Pacific and the Atlantic. Well, the Atlantic, of course, had the German submarines, and they had the more uh, or advanced mines that were to be the problem, whereas the Japanese had the old moored mines, and as far as I know, that's all they ever had. That's all we ever ran into.
Would you go in prior to invasion, say of Guam or Saipan, and sweep mines for the?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, we do that, and also we were preparing for what they call the Majestic operation, which was the invasion of Japan itself, and sweeping in the Sea of Japan when my ship was detached from the sweep and sent to join up with Leland Jackson and his group to sweep in ahead of the surrender fleet, the invasion fleet, that into Tokyo Bay.
And many of those mines have been dropped by our own airplanes.
They had been, and any of the sophisticated type mines, the pressure mines, the magnetic and the acoustical mines were all U.S. manufacture and dropped by our own people. I don't know whether it was the Air Force or the Navy Air that dropped them. But
well,
they didn't know exactly where they were, so we had time trying to find them.
I know that the B-29s was stood down from bombing of the Japanese islands at the request of Admiral Nimitz for about 10 days or 2 weeks, and they dropped thousands of mines. And I'm sure the Navy aviation did the same thing. We just almost shut down the commerce, the freighters going in and out of Japan.
Well, I know that because we were down into the inland sea there,
Mm-hmm.
and we're getting ready to clear that up when I was detached and sent back to the United States and released to inactive duty. So I didn't get involved in that cleanup.
It was a massive job, I'm sure.
It was, from what I hear, the people talk about it, the way that they had to, the acoustical and magnetic mines, we had ways to do that, but the pressure mines we didn't. So the Japanese cooperated with us, and they got some of their old freighters, loaded them up with lumber, and then they'd tow them up through the channel, and they'd hit one of those, go over one of those mines, and it would blow up, but the ship wouldn't sink. They could get it over to the shore somewhere, and then come in with another one. So that's the way they detonated them. Found out where they were.
It's almost a matter of life and death for the Japanese because they can't live without ocean traffic and commerce.
That's right. And bless their hearts, they were really working hard and ready to put up a tremendous fight. At the time, the atomic bombs discouraged them from continuing the war.
How did you feel about the invasion of Japan?
Well, we just look forward to it like they look forward to any other invasion. Okinawa, Guam, or anything like that, although we knew there would be rougher because the Japanese citizens would going to take part, as well as the Army and the Navy and whatever Air Force they had left.
Well, the experience we had on Okinawa, where they all fought to the death, would have been...
That'd have been the same thing in the mainland of Japan, I'm sure.
Horrendous bloodletting.
Yeah, they estimated there would be over 2 million casualties, and that's why killing off several 100,000 with an atomic bomb was really a blessing, rather than go through with the war and have far more casualties.
General Paul Tibbets, who was a pilot in Enola Gay, was in Atlanta 2 or 3 years ago, and gave a speech out on 285 at a Holiday Inn. And of course the place was packed, and it struck me that the Marines and the ground troops particularly would go over and thank him for ending the war, because otherwise they figured they'd be dead.
Well, that a lot of them would have been killed, and a lot of the minesweepers would have been sunk and destroyed, and the crews captured, and there would be no imprisonment, I don't think. If they were captured, they'd be all tortured and death.
Suicide. Japanese were very tenacious fighters.
Although when we were sweeping in the Bay of Japan, we did notice a prison over there, and I think it was mostly Air Force people. They had a big sign up there welcoming us, so that they had some prisoners. They didn't kill everybody.
Somebody has estimated that had the war lasted another year, every Allied prisoner of the Japanese would be dead.
Well, I think so, because they were short of food themselves, and the Americans couldn't live on the rations that the Japanese could live on.
Yeah, and of course their military code, Bushido, it was a disgrace for Japanese to be captured.
Oh, right.
So you were there when Japan surrendered and then stayed in Japan for a short period of time before you came?
Yes, we stayed in Japan for, well, let's see, the surrender was in September, and we stayed there through, my ship through December, sweeping mines in various ports so that the American ships could get in and bring food and so forth in the Japanese minefields.
Well, that was a very important function, because it was either get the food in or they would starve to death.
That's right, and the United States had done, I thought, a wonderful job of repatriating Japan and making them our friends instead of doing like Iraq and making them our enemies.
That's true. It was a very enlightened occupation, I think. With all his faults, General MacArthur did a marvelous job.
I think he did too.
I don't know whether you call it civilizing Japan or democratizing it.
Well, they're probably both.
And they're our friends today, I think.
Well, they should be.
So then you came back to the United States, and shortly thereafter you left the Navy.
Well, no, I went to inactive duty, but then I went to work with this, called them the Atlanta Battalion of the Naval Reserve, and the Naval Reserve Officer School, which was operated by Captain George Griffin from Georgia Tech, and I was his assistant and executive officer, and did a lot of the planning and all for that. It was one of those active reserve units where you meet once a month and show a film or have some kind of program that bring the officers up to date.
And you would meet down at Georgia Tech, would you not?
Well,
You'd meet at Georgia Tech?
yes, we did.
I had some friends who were aviators, and they used to meet at the old Naval Air Station.
Well, that's where we met. Usually, to begin with, out at the Naval Air Station, which is now the Fulton County Airport. But then they closed that down. It was the Naval Air Station. They closed that down, so we started meeting at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, the Naval Air Station is now part of Dobbins Air Force Base, you know.
Well,
And they have essentially the same mission, I'm told, reserve training base.
I'm not familiar with what they do.
So even though you were out of uniform, you still put on a uniform about once a month and went to training?
Well, twice a week.
Twice a week?
We had some kind of thing going on there for a while.
Well, the Pacific War was essentially a naval war, and I've always had a great admiration for Admiral Nimitz. He certainly was one of our finest commanders in World War II. And it's interesting that On the other end of the Pacific, they had General Douglas MacArthur, and of course, I'm sure the Navy and the Army staffs were fighting, but apparently the relationship between Nimitz and MacArthur was reasonably amicable.
Well, I wasn't involved in that, so I don't know. I just would hear rumors of this, that, and the other. We were going to do this and do that, and then they do something entirely different.
Well, in reflecting on your World War II experience, what lessons do you think you've learned?
Well, I've learned that everything that I knew at that time is now obsolete,
That's true.
and that whatever we go through in the future is going to be entirely different situation, and that people of my age and status and all have no business being involved in it because we don't know what in the hell's happening.
We don't have the training.
That's right.
They have these atomic submarines that now the size of, at least the size of cruisers.
Oh yeah, they 6,000–7,000 tons.
And with enough firepower to wipe out a nation.
Wipe out a nation several times.
Several times over, you're right. Well, we've been involved in the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Panama, this business down in Africa, and the first Gulf War.
And the Bay of Pigs.
Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
Oh, what's your evaluation of the Bay of Pigs?
I think it was a stupid thing to begin with, and I don't know why the instigators of it continued to push it to realize that they couldn't handle it.
Castro has outlasted every president since Eisenhower. Still in charge down there, 90 miles off our shore. It was a disaster, and I don't know if I have the. All I know is what I read in some of these history books, but it seemed to me that President Kennedy leaned on his brother Robert, who certainly was no military strategist. I think he was in the Navy and might have been an enlisted man. But it's possible if they had brought in air cover, that Cuban brigade could have prevailed. But
Oh yeah, that's if they'd had the support that they counted on, I'm sure it would have been successful.
I've always liked what General Patton said. Audace, audace, audace. Well, we have a totally different situation nowadays. We have a volunteer military. We have no draft. And the reports are that bases are going to be closed. And there are some congressmen who say we need more military, and they're talking about 20,000 more or 40,000 more. It's hard to realize that we had 16 million men under arms in World War II at one time or another compared to what they have today.
Well, I think it is too, and I don't know how many they need today because they have so many mechanical men, so to speak, that do the job of that the ordinary soldier used to do or the Navy. I know the ships operate with less people now than they used to.
Well, you know, you have a very interesting display on the wall, and I'm going to walk over here and point to some of them and ask you to comment. You'll have to speak up a little louder. Are we in the upper left-hand corner?
Mm-hmm.
All right, the upper left-hand corner, the first thing you have is what they call a commission pennant that comes when the ship is first commissioned. They fly that pennant from the mainmast And then when the captain who puts it in commission is retired, why, it's given to him as a souvenir of his tour of duty with the ship. And that one is from the USS Pochard, which was built and commissioned in Savannah, Georgia. And the upper left-hand document there, I think, is my commission as a naval ensign from Georgia Tech. The one right below it is a report from I forget what you call it, a commendation letter. Oh, and then over the head is a display of the medals and ribbons that I won while I was in service. And to the right of that is a document of my promotion to captain, and down below that is a document of my discharge from the Navy with good conduct and service. And the hat is the one that I wore in service, and my Navy sword is crossed with a Japanese sword which I acquired in Tokyo. And below that is a write-up from the Bermuda Gazette and Colonist Daily concerning the rescue of the two Bermudians. And over to the right, starting at the top, are the four ships that I commanded: the USS Governor, AMC-82, and the USS Dynamic, AM-91, the USS Competent, AM-316, and the USS Pochard, AM-375, which was built in Savannah. And also to the right of that is the commissioning pennant from the USS Competent, AM-316. I didn't get one from the Dynamic, I don't know why, but I put it in commission and stayed with it until it was put into dry dock.
Dynamic was your last command, and active command, right? In the
No, no, the Pochard was the last active
Pochard.
command.
And I see your degree from Georgia Tech and your diploma from Boys High School.
That's right.
In the Wall Street Journal dated May 5th, 1950.
That's my birthday.
You were born and went down the corner and bought the paper, I think.
That's right. I sent my mother out to get me a paper so I'd know what was going on in the world.
I see a professional engineering registration. I
Yes,
suppose
I got that as a air conditioning engineer to
that's very interesting. Newsmakers of Tomorrow and in the Time magazine. That's your picture there?
That's what I wanted to mention next. If they, when you want to show it, is that they had a campaign in Atlanta for the young men that would be the newsmakers of tomorrow, selected to 50, and they were given a big dinner at the driving club by Time magazine, and I was selected as one of them, but unfortunately I moved my plant and business from Atlanta out to Douglasville right after that, and so I was never able to participate in all the Atlanta activities that I intended to.
You had a plant at Douglasville.
Yes, sheet metal manufacturing company.
Douglas County is booming now.
So your picture's right in the center then?
Yeah, they gave one of those to each of us at the banquet.
Reminds me of a television program we used to have, This Is Your Life.
Uh,
What year did you graduate from Georgia Tech, if I may
I
ask?
graduated in 1937.
37. So you had 3 years before you went in the Navy, in civilian life.
That's right. Well, I was in the Naval Reserve, Atlanta Reserve, under Harry Dobbs at that time. It's not as good now as it ought to be. I fell and broke my hip last Christmas time, and I've got a bunch of this, they call it what is it? It's a staph infection that's not controllable by antibiotics. And I was delirious for about 3 weeks, and then in the hospital, and then came here to Canterbury Court to their infirmary for 2 months. And during that time, I have no idea what was going on. I run into something new every day that somebody tells me, well, do you remember so-and-so? And I don't, because I lost a lot of my memory, and I'm not familiar with other things that happened. And that is true about my Navy career. I've lost a lot of that memory. I'll recover it. If I think about it for any length of time, it'll come back to me, but it doesn't come back just right off the bat like it used to.
Of course, being junior officers, we weren't privy to all the plans that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were making and that sort of thing. But there's so much literature nowadays. One book I read that really I found very interesting was FDR's Commander-in-Chief. And it spoke to his ability to pick commanders. For instance, I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that General Marshall was the right man in the right place at the right time. And then he had to relieve his old friend, Admiral Stark, after Pearl Harbor. He sent him to Europe and put Admiral King in command.
Well, Admiral King was in the Atlantic Fleet. That's where I knew him, because the ship at Bermuda operated under the Atlantic Command.
Yeah, he was a commander of the Atlantic, you're right.
Commander of the Atlantic Fleet. As Nimitz was commander of the Pacific Fleet.
But I had the impression that Nimitz pretty much ran the Pacific. King was not as directly involved in the Pacific as he was in the Atlantic.
No, I don't think so. I think he was mostly Atlantic and Chief of Staff.
But they had some fine commanders out there in the Pacific. Spruance, for instance, Bull Halsey.
They were. They won the war for us.
Yes, they did. Well, have you had a full recovery from your hip problem?
No, I still have my hip problem, and I still have the results of the infection, the staph infection that give me trouble, and my lungs have kind of gone out as a result of all of that. So I'm on oxygen most of the time.
Well, I salute you, sir, for your distinguished service both in peace and war. And you are certainly an example of the type of American citizen that rallied to the colors and helped us to win World War II. It's been a
I tell you,
pleasure to meet you and to have take part in this interview.
It was a pleasure to be involved in this interview, and I'm right proud of what I did during World War II, although it was nothing spectacular. Didn't get any real commendations. That 4 battle stars is about all, and then I enjoy very much looking back on it as a pleasant period in my life that turned out very happily. And of course I wasn't married at that time, but when I came back I got married, so that's also a pleasant time.
Ready.
Boys High Class of 1933, it says here that David D. Long, Zodiac, Highwire, Tatler, Sports Editor, Honor Roll, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, Quill and Scroll, I can't pronounce that, Allophronium?
Alsophronium, that's the magazine.
And you were the class championship football team, 1933. What was that?
That was just, they have an inter-class football competition.
You beat up on the juniors and the sophomores.
Well, our class won the championship, so we beat up on somebody, but I can't remember who all it was.
And Boys High and Tech High always went at it. When was it? Thanksgiving time, was it?
Well, they always went at it, that's for sure.
Senior Invitation Committee, Home Class Officer, Officers Club, ROTC. You were captain in an ROTC, and I noticed
Yeah, I was with the A Company in the competition, and we beat Tech High School in that. I do remember that.
And then with Georgia Tech, you were battalion commander of the Naval.
That's right.
That's the top cadet rank, if I recall correctly.
That's right. Well, I was on the honor roll for 4 years, and had the highest scholastic average of any of the officers. So they go by that rather than your military ability or the naval ability.
Well, you certainly had a distinguished career in high school, and you're all somebody did quite a job of putting all this together. Here's your honor society. What's it, Phi Eta Sigma?
That's the freshman at Georgia Tech.
And that's academic achievement.
Yes.
1937 honoraries. Georgia Tech class of 1937. You were considerably younger in those days. Here's your picture.
Yep.
David Daniel Long Jr., Atlanta, Georgia. General Science, SAE, Sigma Alpha Epsilon. You were president of it, apparently. ODK, Phi Kappa Phi. President's Gold T. Phi Eta Sigma. Honor Roll all 4 years. Treasurer of the Science Club.
The Science Club.
What was the Bulldog Club?
The Bulldog Club was just a social organization.
Well, since I went to Athens, I'm familiar with the Bulldogs.
Yeah.
Every year Tech tried to beat up on us.
Well, one of those pages later on in there shows the Bulldog Club, and might give you a little write-up on it. They gave some kind of award each year for something so that they were considered legitimate.
Well, maybe we should have started a Yellow Jacket Club over in Athens.
You could have.
In 1935, I'm trying to remember, Coach Alexander was the football coach.
That's right. And Bobby Dodd was his assistant in 1936, which was the last year that I was there for football season.
The first time I ever remember being in Grant Field, President Franklin Roosevelt came to Atlanta to dedicate the Techwood Homes project, and he spoke at Grant Field. In the first football game I remember, there was an end named Dutch Coneman,
Yep.
and they were playing Clemson. I've forgotten the quarterback. It might have been Fletcher Sims, but I'm not sure.
Fletcher Sims was later on, I think, and Howard Ector was later on, and I was trying to think of the Georgia boy that used to run wild up and down the field there. And
Is that Bill Hartman?
no, it was, well, anyway, those are the things that I forget that I would like to forget, so.
Tech used to beat us regularly every year in those days. I was telling you about the first football game I saw at Grant Field, and it was against Clemson. And for three quarters, there was no score. Finally, in about the last 5 minutes, somebody threw a pass to Dutch Coneman, and he caught it in the end zone and posed for the cameras. At any rate, the headline was, he almost forgot to score. Instead of the Constitution. At any rate, Tech won the game. Phi Kappa Phi, that's Scholastic Honorary Fraternity. You were always on the honor roll.
Yeah, I was fortunate that I made good grades, but I was pulled out of school some during grammar school years, and I taught it at home because of sickness. And my mother taught me real well how to study. And so as a result of all the rest of the time, I did very well scholastically.
You know, that's a secret. You know how to study.
Yeah, that's,
I notice here you're in the Scabbard and Blade, and in the pictures here you have both the Army and the Navy ROTC.
that's right. It's a military organization.
We had Scabbard and Blade in Georgia, but they don't have a naval.
You didn't have a naval over there.
No. They have Air Force there now. And it's a pretty active program, I'm told. Here's the Bulldog Club. That's a junior honorary social society. Amazing. My good friend was Billy Beers. I think Billy graduated about 1930, I think he told me.
I don't know. I know Dick Beard was in my class.
Billy's father started Beers Construction Company, and Billy was a president of it for many years.
No, oh, you talking about Beers?
Here you are, battalion commander of the Navy ROTC. There was, I think, I'm trying to remember, did you ever know Bob Thorpe?
Oh yeah.
His brother was a naval officer in a submarine.
Mac Thorpe was he was killed in the war of something, his older brother Mac.
Yeah.
And then there was Ernest Thorpe. And I think there was a third brother in there somewhere, I thought.
I think you're right. At any rate, Mac Thorpe, I think, was killed on a submarine.
No,
Then Bob Eisen was in submarines,
yeah.
and so was Dean Spradlin. So I always identified the Naval ROTC at Tech with a submarine service.
Well, a lot of them went into submarines because engineering degree was right helpful.
Yeah, you had to have an engineering degree to get a submarine to go through that subcourse
Oh,
in
yeah.
London.
Well, if you're going into submarines, they give you one that,
Well, it's a very dangerous service. I have read that the highest casualty rate of any particular service during World War II was the German submarine service.
well, they were very reckless.
And we're fortunate that they did have such a high casualty rate because, you know, the submarines almost ruled the North Atlantic then in '43 till we got our anti-sub act together.
Yeah, until they started using convoys. Yeah, they were.
Then they could give them aerial coverage with the PBYs and the Liberators.
They would do that. And as you say, until then, while the Atlantic coast there was right bloody and oil soaked from the ships that were sunk.
Francis recently had an interview with a lady who was a code breaker in the Naval Service. And in her interview, she said they started to read Admiral Dernett's orders to the submarine fleet in the North Atlantic. And when they had that information in hand, they could route the convoys around the submarine wolf packs.
Oh,
It was a great help in defeating the submarines.